The Secret Science at Work by Max Freedom Long. Chapter 13. Contacts made through signatures, also signatures, auras, and measurements. When the Telepathic Mutual Healing Group was organized, very little was known concerning the Aka structures of the signatures written in ink, except that in some way there was attached to each signature an Aka thread, which led back to the one who had signed his name and had gazed at the writing. We still do not know just how and why an Aka thread fastened to a signature is retained by it better than a similar Aka thread fastened to a plain sheet of paper through touch and look. The fact, however, was well established by our telepathic experiments, and for that reason the letters, each with its signature written in ink, were used successfully in establishing and maintaining contact with me at the center. For almost a year, we of the HRA were forced to rely entirely upon the Huna theory of the Aka thread, or the cord of connection, simply because it worked. The telepathic contacts were made beyond a question of doubt, as pictures, symbols, and colors were being sent and being received again and again. Then came two proofs of the validity of the theory of the Aka thread contact, and much more light on the entire matter. In 1949, Dr. Oscar Brunler, Brunler, mentioned before as a physicist of distinction, arrived from England to make his home in California. The HRAs of the center became acquainted with his work through his lectures, and because he became a member of our group, an outstanding contribution to our knowledge of the Aka cord of connection when running between a signature and its owner was made indirectly through Dr. Brunler's earlier discovery that a signature held precisely the same vibratory rate or kind of radiation as the person who writes it. It is a fascinating story of discovery, and one that deserves more than a passing mention. As recounted in another connection, for many centuries, the psychic abilities of the low self have been put to use in such things as water dowsing, with the aid of a forked twig taken from a living tree, or the use of a simple pendulum. In late years, such instruments as the Cameron orometer, CAMERON, orometer, have been invented. In all cases, no matter what instrument is used, the idea is to furnish the low self with some mechanical means through which it can report its findings to the middle self. For one who has sufficient psychic skill and training, it is possible to sense water under the ground without the use of a willow fork, pendulum, or instrument. A few years ago, the press dispatches told of a boy in Africa who could see psychically into the earth, and who had made a fine reputation for himself by locating water, gold deposits, and diamonds. For the less able and less fully trained, the instrumental aid is of much value. The pendulum, because of its simplicity and because it can swing in various ways and directions, has been a favorite crutch to help George tell his conscious mind or middle self what he has learned when instructed to make a psychic investigation of something, be it underground water or minerals or the condition of organs hidden inside the body. As in our box tests, the low self can penetrate certain coverings, investigate what is underneath, and report by using a prearranged code of swings, the convention in quotes. In Europe, the use of the pendulum has been commonplace for many years and has been recognized as practical and legitimate, provided the user can prove his ability. In America, for a number of reasons, the use of the pendulum has been almost entirely neglected until the last decade, when even a slight interest in its use was stirred amongst the classes of occultists and some of the leaders of the health food movements. The pendulum, having been proven excellent as an aid in learning what foods were suitable for the operator of the pendulum and what were not. Unfortunately, many persons of the irresponsible element pounced upon the pendulum and undertook to use it for some form of fortune-telling. That, of course, partly discredited the use of such an instrument even in the hands of proven experts. In France, where the pendulum was widely accepted long ago, it was used by a certain M. Bovis, B-O-V-I-S, in connection with a ruler 100 centimeters long to give readings in terms of centimeters when testing material things. He had determined on a convention or code in which his low self could make known its findings in terms of measurement on the measuring stick. 100 centimeters or degrees was taken as the measure for a perfect egg, cask of wine, cheese, apple, bottle of olive oil, and later in diagnostic work for stomach, liver, eyes, or teeth. Anything, dead or alive, so long as it was physical and sufficiently material to contact, could be investigated by M. Bovis's trained low self to ascertain its purity or the state of health. The answer to be given in terms of centimeters by making the pendulum swing as agreed upon when held over the right part of the measuring stick. The procedure was simple. A sample of the thing to be tested A sample of the thing to be tested was placed on one end of the measuring stick, or the left hand of the operator was placed on the thing to be tested, as on a cheese or a cask of wine. The right hand, holding the pendulum, was then moved slowly from the 0 end of the measuring stick towards the 100 centimeter end. The low self, as it had been taught, made the pendulum swing all the time, but in a diagonal or circling direction. Only when the correct place on the stick was reached for the reading to be indicated did the pendulum begin to swing at exactly right angles to the stick. To make his hand steadier in the holding of the pendulum, M. Bovis mounted a metal plate on a slotted board so that the measure could be slid slowly under the plate while the pendulum was swinging. On the plate he marked diagonal lines as well as lines to show the exact angle, the exact right angle, and the simple instrument worked very well indeed. He named it the biometer. Later on he evolved a fine theory in which he suggested that all things sent off radiations and that his biometer simply helped to measure the wavelength of the radiations and report them in terms of his centimeter degrees. He even went one step further and announced that by multiplying his centimeter reading in degrees by 0.065, one could turn the reading into angstrom units and identify the radiations in terms of everything from infrared to ultraviolet light. The biometer was a great success. M. Bovis earned a living for some time as a special inspector for the French government. With his biometer, he could grade casks of wine, cakes of cheese, almost anything, and do it much better and faster than could be done by any other method. From this, to the inspections and testing of the various parts and organs of the body was a simple step which M. Bovis took without hesitation. I guess the M is for Monsieur Bovis. All right, M. Bovis took without hesitation. His diagnostic ventures were so successful that doctors began to send patients to him when they could not determine the nature of some obscure malady. The use of the biometer spread, and soon the inventor added several other devices to his list, all being simple instruments designed to allow his low self to describe the state of one's health in terms of some form of measurement, as in the degrees of the circle, and so forth. Among the HRAs, we were fortunate enough to have a member who possessed a complete set of the Bovis instruments, even though it was some time after the death of the inventor and the cessation of the manufacture of such things as the biometer, tetrameter, TETRAMETER, radiograph, and dosimeter jumel. Let me spell that for you. DOSIMETER JUMELLE. All were tested at the center and were found both practical and surprisingly accurate, provided always that the low self of the operator was properly trained and grounded in the use of the instruments and the convention of measurement to be used. While Monsieur Bovis was still alive, Dr. Brunner became interested in the biometer, and the theory had been offered to explain that it was measuring radiations in terms of degrees biometric, or centimeters, which could be converted to readings in terms of colors. He purchased a biometer and took it to England with him. There he learned to use it expertly and convinced himself that it was practical. Being also an inventor and an investigator, it was no long time before Dr. Brunner had increased the length of the measuring stick on the biometer to a full 1,000 centimeters and was measuring radiations which he had found to lie in the range from 100 degrees biometric upward toward the 1,000 degree limit. In this new range, he identified radiations which seemed to come from the mind or soul, the very innermost being or self of human beings. For the sake of simplicity, he called these radiations brain radiations, but warned that he was not measuring the physical health of the brain or its tissues. This was a great discovery. He was able to measure the consciousness, the level of intelligence, the personality, and the character on the changed biometer. By making a great many readings of different individuals and by classifying the readings according to his extended study of the persons so read, he was able to evolve a scale of measurements for intelligence and general or all-over personality, seeking for a way to explain the fact that some men had higher readings than others and far greater intellectual endowments. He settled upon the theory that mankind is in a fluid state of mental or soul evolution. He postulated that through a series of incarnations, men evolved higher and higher in the scale until they at last reached a final goal, a definite goal. The nature of the goal was not something so simple to determine. He needed to know just how high a reading, in terms of the degree biometric, a person would have to reach through evolution before he had finished his course and moved on to something still higher. In his search for limitations in the high degree brackets, he undertook tests aimed at getting readings from the great men of the past, testing the things they had left behind: manuscripts, paintings, statues done in marble and stone. He made the further discovery that the signature on a letter, a document, or painting carried in some mysterious way the same radiation as its maker, living or long dead. He compared readings made directly from individuals with readings taken from their signatures, and in every case he found the two readings identical on the biometer. Soon he was testing musty documents, writings in archives, paintings in famous galleries. By testing these signatures of famous men, checking the signatures written by them at various times in their lives, on into their old age, he found that the average of evolutionary growth during one lifetime was between 1 and 6 degrees biometric. The latter was the highest he ever discovered, and a rare stride upward, which seemed to have been made only because of much suffering. The implication was made clear when he considered his further finding that the average reading of primitive men was around 200 degrees, and the reading of the most advanced stood not higher than 725. Allowing a degree of revolutionary growth per lifetime, the number of incarnations demanded would be about 550. The highest reading which Dr. Brunler ever found came from a picture of a cloth reputed to have been used to wipe the face of Jesus when he suffered during his crucifixion. The cloth supposedly had been marked with the imprint of his face, and it was and it still is revered in a famous church in southern Europe. The reading was an even 1,000 degrees biometric. Dr. Brunler freely admitted that the relic might not be genuine, or that the reading might be colored by his own inner reactions, but he was, so he told me, inclined to place the limit of evolution at the 1,000 degree point, at which point the transition would take place, which would bring man to his goal, whatever that may be. Among these great men of the past, whose readings were taken from their signatures, and which could be considered entirely reliable, the highest evolved ever found was the painter, writer, and inventor, the all-round genius, Leonardo da Vinci. His reading was 725 degrees. Below his level ranged the other great painters, and below them came the great composers. Next came the great writers, and then the great statesmen, followed by the generals. Men of science were found in these high levels also. Scarcely anyone under 450 degrees has ever become lastingly famous. The average person in Europe and America stands around the 250 level, while the men of less advanced countries average around 225, The lowest readings were around 118 degrees, and these came from those who were barely above the level of the imbecile. The personality pattern, in quotes, personality pattern, was also registered on the biometer, but not in terms of centimeters or measure, as in the case of intelligence. Clockwise and counterclockwise movements, when the pendulum responded with circling movements, determined whether the one read was constructive or destructive, basically good or bad. The will was also measured and registered in straight back and forth swings, these being to the right or to the left of the ideal or upright mark on the plate of the biometer, the right angle mark in relation to the measuring stick, although the latter does not come into the picture in measuring the personality pattern. The puzzling matter of how measures... Now, let me start the sentence again. The puzzling matter of how signatures could carry the same radiation and the same strength of radiation as the body or mind of the one who had written the signature was never satisfactorily explained, except in terms of the Aka thread, which allows the low self of the operator of the biometer to stick out a finger, follow the thread, make the contact with the writer of the signature, be he alive or long dead, and in spirit. By accepting the Huna explanation that through the Aka thread the low self can find and measure the maker of the signature even if he is not in flesh, we have additional proof that it is the consciousness or soul that is being measured and not the physical body. More than that, we have here the proof that intelligence and personality characteristics reside in the selves, in quotes, selves, that make up the man and survive physical death. This conclusion permits the assumption that reincarnations must explain further evolution. My personal experience in using the biometer has been that when the signature is in the clip at the end of the measuring stick and my right hand holds the pendulum over the plate, ready to be used to convey the result of the investigation of the low self and to give its reading, there is a pause in which I feel nothing. I simply sit relaxed but attentive while I wait. Then, after a pause of perhaps from 20 to 30 seconds, I feel a very slight something in the pit of my stomach, and the pendulum begins to swing as of its own accord. I move the measuring stick slowly so that the signature gradually comes nearer the plate over which the pendulum is swinging, and at first the pattern swings are given. They stop, and I again move the signature closer. It is now at the point where the highest grade of intelligence is to be found. The movement continues closer and closer, and the pendulum swings steadily in a diagonal to the line on the plate that marks the right angle to the measuring stick, which is sliding slowly under the plate. Then, when the right distance has been reached, the pendulum gradually changes so that it swings exactly over the right angle line. When this is exact, I usually feel a very slight jerk in my wrist and the pendulum stops. I then read the stick at the place where it meets the plate, and the reading is completed and I am ready to record it. Someday, we shall be using the biometer as a matter of course, testing the very young to learn what personality pattern they possess and what level of intelligence they have, as this personality pattern can be much improved if less than good and normal, and as the will can be trained successfully. Much can be done to guide the child in these directions of growth. As the intelligence level changes, but a degree or two in the average lifetime, the child can be encouraged to take up training for the type of occupation that will best suit his level of mental ability. There are a few things which need to be learned about the use of the biometer. The Brunner reading system still lacks a niche for the natural talents, such as those for music or art or mechanics. These need to be accounted for so that a child who is not at all musical, for instance, can be spared a musical training and given one that will better fit some other talent. Most promising of all is the prospect that, given time, we can find the best way to measure the low self and the middle self separately on the biometer and learn their respective standings and natures. We may even be able to measure the high self. In addition, it would seem possible to measure the degree of trouble which may be caused for an individual by the presence of complexes and by obsessional influences. The ability of the low self to determine things seems almost unlimited, and it is to be guessed that in the making of the very difficult measurements, the high self may sometimes lend a helping hand. To get back to the signature and the aka thread connected to it, we come to a second set of proofs, which were offered sometime after work with the biometer was begun. One day, when HRA Vern Cameron was visiting me in the study. One day when HRA Vern Cameron was visiting me in the study, and after we had run a series of tests on ivory figurines which had been worked over experimentally to make them into icons, in brackets, to give them artificial aka auras, and to make them centers for certain beneficial forces, close bracket. We fell to talking about the use of signatures in making biometric readings, and the question was raised as to whether or not a signature had an aka body or aura. Using the arometer, Mr. Cameron began tests over a signature which I provided, and in a matter of less than a minute he had outlined an aura over the signature that was like a thin or irregular fan rising from it and extending some 2 feet above it and trailing off to a 6-foot point at the far end. At the pointed end, it was guessed that the connecting aka thread led off to make contact with the distant writer of the signature. Oddly enough, the arometer seems not to register the aka thread leading from a signature. It may be that it is too fine and slight to set up a positive or negative mana field to influence the head of the arometer, or it may be that unless the aka thread is actuated as during a biometric reading of a signature, the mana made to flow through it, the thread itself remains almost a nothingness insofar as substance or mana is concerned. And then it says in brackets, tests will later be made on this point. Almost all objects which have been held in the hands and concentrated upon with the intention of giving them an artificial aura have, when the work is finished, an aka cord of a peculiar kind, which seems to take the form of a strong beam of force, extending from the object in some direction and disappearing in the distance or through the ceiling into the empty air. In any event, even if the aka thread is idle and provides no beam or indication of a force or mana flow, the signature definitely has an aka body. This can be accounted for only by supposing that some of the abundant aka substance of the low self of the writer is fastened to the writing, and that it remains there. The most significant thing about the fan-shaped aura rising from a signature and extending from it forward and backward, but not downward, is that no two signatures so far tested show the same shape. Some are rounded and high at the top, some are low and notched and broken. The size and the shape differ from one to another in endless way. Each aura is as individual and unmistakable as a fingerprint. Work must be undertaken to continue the study of this new discovery. While it is too early to hazard a guess as to the direction in which studies may lead, it seems possible that in the general outlines and contours of the signature auras there may lie indicators which will tell us something about the individuals. Just what may be told remains to be seen. It might even develop that the lacking biometric indication of special talent might be deduced from the aura pattern of the signature once we know the meaning of the angles, turns, and domes, or the nicks and deeper indentations, or of the strange thin projections sometimes observed. Not only are we discovering the knowledge of Huna and its uses, but we stand on the threshold of many new discoveries, which will soon become landmarks as we press forward in this still little explored field. And this concludes chapter 13. Chapter 14 is entitled More Findings of the HRA.